In combat with Allied forces, the Japanese Imperial Army utilized light and medium tanks in support of infantry in direct frontal attacks. After the infantry reached their objective, the tanks were withdrawn without attempting to exploit the limited gains. In the jungles of Malaya, for example, tanks were brought up wherever the Japanese infantry was unable to advance. The tanks normally attempted to force a passage for the infantry by a frontal assault. If this failed, the tanks were sent against the hostile flanks. On occasion, however, Japanese tanks attacked by moving directly down roads with the infantry following in trucks. Unless effective roadblocks were prepared by Allied forces, tanks struck at artillery and other installations as much as 8 to 10 miles in the rear of the main Allied positions. When a roadblock was encountered, fire from the tanks was used to get around the flanks by infiltration tactics. Tank battles rarely occurred. Only a very few operations involved Allied tanks directly against Japanese armored vehicles. Tactical studies in the 1930s Japanese Army Tank School, however, give precise instructions for the employment of large armored formations. For an attack on a lightly held enemy position, Japanese doctrine maintains that a minimum of 30 to 40 tanks are required. If the enemy is in a strongly defended position, it is stated that at least 60 will be needed, and this number will be increased to 100 in the event hostile artillery shelling and aerial bombing are unusually heavy. Yet, tanks would seem to be an ideal weapon for the Japanese in the envelopment maneuvers that are so favored in their tactical doctrine. Where the terrain is favorable, it can be anticipated that they will utilize tanks in wide and circling movements to cut hostile lines of communications and strike at vital rear areas. Japanese tactical doctrine stressed the utilization of tanks in what is termed a mobile mass. In operations in which they were committed in such a fashion, tanks constitute the main fire element in what is essentially an attempt to attain a decisive victory in one stroke. The Japanese believed that such tank tactics can be resorted to only in suitable terrain, and that the nature of the terrain really is the chief limitation upon the employment of large tank formations. In any event, tanks were committed as a mobile mass only at a certain time and place when a decision of the entire army is in balance. If these conditions prevail, Japanese doctrine maintained that the loss of even the entire combat power of tanks will be justified in view of the magnitude of the results achieved. Weaknesses and disadvantages of tanks were also recognized by the Japanese army. Yet, the great advantages of tanks, the high mobility, great offensive and firepower, as well as the power to crush and penetrate, cannot be found to a comparable degree in other weapons, and the Japanese recognized that the tank will be used to an increasing extent by modern armies. According to Japanese planners, when the objective is to secure a decision by armored operations alone, tanks should not be committed in a piecemeal fashion and should never be used in a struggle of attrition. At best, tanks require extensive maintenance facilities, damage and loss in combat normally will be severe, and replacement both of equipment and personnel is difficult. Ideally, tanks employed in mobile mass should be directed against weak spots in the enemy's lines, according to the doctrine. Despite Japanese appreciation of the potentialities of mass employment of tanks, the infantry support role was emphasized, affecting not only tank tactics but also the design of tank material. Although Japanese tanks did not compare unfavorably with armored vehicles used by the Allies in their speed-weight ratios, they lost speed on cross-country runs. Japanese tanks were bulkier in proportion to their weight when comparable Allied vehicles because of their smaller armor bases. This feature was a direct resultant of the fact that tactically the Japanese relied primarily upon their infantry to neutralize hostile anti-tank weapons. However, when Japanese tanks were attached to infantry, one of their missions was to eliminate the anti-tank weapons not neutralized by artillery fire. Another connection between equipment and tactics can be seen in the allocation of radio sets. Only one set was issued to each tank platoon, and this factor inevitably entails constriction of the area of maneuver of tank units. If the platoon leader's tank was knocked out in combat, the entire platoon was deprived of all except visual communication with higher echelon command. Japanese reliance upon explains the existence of a large number of independent tank units in the Japanese army, which readily could be attached to infantry commands. This factor also explains the failure to coordinate the artillery with tank units more effectively, for artillery too frequently is put under infantry control. Japanese tactical doctrine distinguished between two methods of tank cooperation with infantry. One method required the tank commander to designate the infantry forces with which the tank are to cooperate in response to such requests for support as are received from the infantry commanders concerned. The other method was predicated upon advanced specification of the objectives which the tanks will attack. If the former plan was utilized, that is, if the tanks were directly allotted to infantry units, the tank regiment commander gave the general outline of the plan and left the details of its execution to the tank company commanders. On the other hand, if the tanks were assigned particular objectives, the tank regiment commander retained direct control throughout the entire course, and the tanks were committed as one unit. This method of tank-infantry cooperation was favored if time was short and it was difficult to foresee changes in the tactical situation that may develop during the engagement. It also must be decided whether the tanks would be used in coordination with infantry primarily for purpose of exploitation, or for the utilization of their movement to facilitate infantry penetration of the enemy line. In exploitation operations, the Japanese tanks would be so deployed and committed that they could seize tactically important areas and strike at enemy artillery or other vital rear installations. If the tanks were utilized to give momentum to the infantry assault, they would advance in close coordination with the infantry. It was possible, according to the Japanese doctrine, to employ both methods simultaneously, particularly if tanks are available in ample numbers. While some could be used for direct support missions, The remainder could be held in reserve for exploitation of such successes as may be achieved by the assault. A number of fundamental principles were emphasized in Japanese infantry tank attacks. Close liaison was maintained at all times, with frequent rallying of the tanks if necessary to ensure maximum coordination of offensive effort. If the infantry assault did not progress as planned, the tanks would concentrate on the enemy obstacles or strong points, which constituted the most effective impediments to forward movement of the infantry. Especially prompt and vigorous action was taken against enemy positions from which flanking fire was being delivered against the Japanese infantry. If Japanese tanks encountered an anti-tank installation within the enemy positions, an immediate decision had to be made whether to detour around it or make a frontal thrust to liquidate it. Rallying points were designated for assembly of the tanks after their mission was accomplished, and preparation for the next attack phase was necessary. The tanks also assembled at rallying points when the assault was suspended at night or because of the tenacity of enemy resistance. Restoration of strength was the main objective of rallying. Sites were chosen to afford maximum efficiency in the regrouping, replacement, and repair of combat vehicles. Special care was also taken to collect all damaged vehicles and to initiate repair where feasible.